It's just before 9 p.m. on April 25th, 2009. Ocean Boulevard in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, is alive with spring break chaos. Neon lights, car stereos, laughter drifting up from the sand. On a grainy security camera inside the Blue Water Resort, a 17-year-old girl steps into frame. Blonde hair, white purse, black and white tank top and shorts. She walks toward the lobby doors, pushes through, and disappears into the night. That girl is Brittanee Drexel, a high school junior from chilly New York. She tells her boyfriend she's heading back to her hotel. Then, nothing. Her text messages stop at 9:15 p.m. Her phone signal begins to move, fast, down the coast, nearly 50 miles south, into a dark, swampy stretch of South Carolina low country. And then, it goes silent. For 13 years, nobody knows for sure what happened after she steps out of that hotel. In that vacuum, theories rush in to fill the void. A runaway, a tragic accident, a sex trafficking ring, a gang stash house where she's held for days, then shot and dumped in an alligator pit. In those same years, an entire family, who will later be proven innocent, is dragged through the mud by a jailhouse snitch, and a story that sounds cinematic, but isn't true. And all the while, the real killer is living just down the coast, shopping in the same stores, driving the same roads, passing day after day the last place Brittanee's phone ever pinged. This is the Evidence Locker, and this is Solved Saturday. Today, we open the case file on the disappearance and murder of Brittanee Drexel. This episode contains descriptions of sexual violence and the murder of a minor. I'll avoid any unnecessary detail, but please take care while listening. Before we talk about theories and suspects and confessions, we need to understand who Brittanee was, and why her trip to Myrtle Beach never should have happened. Brittanee Drexel was born on October 7, 1991, in Rochester, New York, to teenage parents, Dawn and John. Dawn later married a man named Chad Drexel, who adopted Brittanee and raised her as his own. The family settled in Chile, a suburb of Rochester. Brittanee grew into the kind of teenager people noticed, not because she wanted attention, but because she was good. She was a star on her high school soccer team at Gates Chile High. Fast, aggressive on the field, at one point scoring 23 goals in a single season. She loved fashion and cosmetology and dreamed of becoming a nurse or working in beauty. She talked about modeling too. She was also going through something many teenagers face, her parents' separation. In 2009, Dawn and Chad were divorcing, and it hit Brittanee hard. She was strong-willed, independent, and like a lot of 17-year-olds, eager to taste adulthood before it officially arrived. That taste, for her, was spring break. In April 2009, some of Brittanee's friends were planning a trip to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. No parents, a beachfront hotel on North Ocean Boulevard, sun, parties, freedom. To Dawn, the idea felt like a knot in her stomach she couldn't untie. She didn't know these friends well. Myrtle Beach was more than 800 miles away, and she had a bad feeling. So she did what most parents in her position would do. She said no. No to the trip, no to the unsupervised hotel, no to trusting strangers in a spring break crowd that could swallow a 17-year-old girl whole. The argument that followed lasted all day. Doors slammed, voices were raised. Eventually, things cooled off. Brittanee came to her mother with a compromise. She'd stay with a friend in Rochester for 2 days, cool down, get some distance from the tension at home. Dawn agreed. She'd never had reason not to trust her daughter before. On April 22nd, 2009, Brittanee packed a bag and walked out the door. Dawn thought she was going across town. Instead, Brittanee climbed into a car with 3 friends, Jennifer, Philip, and Alana, and started the 13-hour drive south to Myrtle Beach. 3 days later, on April 25th, Brittanee woke up in the Bar Harbor Hotel on Ocean Boulevard, right on the main strip of Myrtle Beach. All day, she did what any teenager on spring break would do. She went to the beach, she hung out with friends, she texted her boyfriend back home, 17-year-old John Grieco. John hadn't come on the trip. He stayed in New York for work, but kept in constant contact with her by text. Because of this, we know a lot about Brittanee's final hours. That evening, sometime after 7 p.m., she realized she had left her flip-flops at the beach. A friend, 20-year-old promoter Peter Brazowitz, who she knew from back home, grabbed them for her. To get them back, Brittanee decided to make the walk, just over a mile, from the Bar Harbor to Peter's motel, the Blue Water Resort. At 7:10 p.m., she told John she was getting ready to go out with her friends that night. On the way, she texted another friend, Jennifer, about borrowing a pair of black shorts. Typical teenage drama over who gets to wear what. At 8:33 p.m., surveillance cameras at the Blue Water captured her walking into the lobby. She went up to Peter's room to collect her shoes. There, according to Peter and his roommates, she was annoyed. She'd argued with Jennifer over those black shorts. She said she'd head back soon to get ready for the night. After about 10 minutes, the men said, she left. At 8:43 p.m., she texted Jennifer, "I'm going to walk all the way back," presumably to return the shorts and meet up again. At 8:45 p.m., cameras saw Brittanee leave the Blue Water Resort and step onto Ocean Boulevard. That would be the last confirmed sighting of her alive. As she walked, she kept texting John. At 8:51 p.m., she sent a text that said, "I'll tell you later when you call me. I'm so heated." John worried but kept trying to keep her spirits up, responding, "Don't let your last night be ruined, baby. Just try to enjoy yourself." She replied at 8:58 p.m., "No, fuck that. I'm staying in and packing and going to sleep probably." That was the last text Brittanee would ever send. At 9:15 p.m., John texted again, "Babe, I'm concerned about ya. I don't want you out alone if your friends are being dicks." There was no reply. He kept trying. Texts, calls, nothing. At some point, John's worry overcame his fear of getting her in trouble. He messaged her. If she didn't respond, he would call her mom and tell her that she wasn't in New York. She was in Myrtle Beach. Still, silence. Early the next day, April 26, 2009, John did the one thing no teenage boyfriend wants to do. He called Dawn Drexel. That was how Dawn first learned that her 17-year-old daughter had not just disobeyed her, she'd left the state. She was in South Carolina, and now she was missing. Dawn and Brittanee's stepfather, Chad, drove straight to Myrtle Beach. By the time they arrived, local police had already started looking. They traced Brittanee's phone, pulled security footage, and headed to the Blue Water Resort. They interviewed Peter and the 4 men sharing his room. He told them Brittanee had come by to get her flip-flops, stayed a short time, then left around 8 p.m. He said he didn't know where she went next. Police searched Brittanee's room at the Bar Harbor. Her clothes were still there. Her purse and phone were not. That suggested that she had not planned to disappear. Something had interrupted an ordinary walk back to her hotel. From there, investigators did what investigators do. They tracked her phone's network pings. The signal showed her phone moving south along Highway 17, through Surfside Beach, Georgetown, and finally into a rural area near the line between Georgetown and Charleston counties, about 50 to 60 miles from Myrtle Beach. Around 11:58 p.m., the pings stopped. Search teams combed marshland, waterways, and woods near that final ping. They used ATVs, horses, helicopters, and sonar. Hundreds of volunteers joined in, day after day. For 11 straight days, they found nothing. So the vacuum opened, and into that vacuum came theory number 1. The simplest explanation was also the most painful for Dawn. Maybe Brittanee had run away. She'd lied about the trip. She'd argued with her mother. She was a teenager testing boundaries 1,000 miles from home. But from the start, her family pushed back hard against this idea. They knew Brittanee. She had strong ties to home, school, soccer, a boyfriend she seemed devoted to. She'd brought clothes, but not the kinds of possessions you take if you're starting a new life. More importantly, the phone evidence didn't fit a runaway. A teenager choosing to vanish doesn't usually hitch a ride nearly 50 miles south into a swampy area, then smash or toss her phone in the middle of the night. Still, for some observers, the runaway narrative stuck. It was convenient. It required no monster, just an impulsive girl. It also risked blunting the urgency of the investigation. And as the years went on with no sign of Brittanee alive, investigators began to publicly lean away from that theory and towards something darker, that she had been abducted and murdered. When a person disappears, the last person to see them alive is always going to attract suspicion. In Brittanee's case, that person was Peter Brazowitz. Peter was a familiar face, someone from back home who was also in Myrtle Beach working as a promoter. But to Dawn, his behavior after Brittanee's disappearance seemed cold. She later said he showed no empathy, no concern, nothing that resembled a worried friend. Peter and the men in his room quickly hired a lawyer. He became, in the media, the last person to see Brittanee alive. There were whispers he'd lured her down to Myrtle Beach, that he or his friends were involved in trafficking her. On the talk show Dr. Phil, Dawn and Peter confronted each other. Peter insisted he'd done nothing wrong and that his reputation had been unfairly destroyed. Dawn, desperate for answers, pressed him. For years, Peter's name sat under a cloud of suspicion, but evidence would eventually clear him. Footage, timelines, and other records put him miles away from where Brittanee's phone last pinged. Law enforcement made it clear he was no longer considered a suspect. The last friend theory was powerful and made for good television. It just wasn't true. The next theory was darker, and in some circles, far more seductive. By 2014, little progress had been made. Dawn eventually moved to Myrtle Beach herself, partly to be close to where her daughter was last seen, and partly to stay on top of the investigation. She started to fear something even worse than murder: human trafficking. Horry County, where Myrtle Beach sits, has a reputation, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes not, as a hub for trafficking and exploitation. In June 2016, the FBI held a press conference that electrified the case. They said that they believed Brittanee had been kidnapped, taken to the area around McClellanville, held in a stash house for several days, sexually assaulted, and then killed. They offered a $25,000 reward and described their evidence as exhaustive, but declined to share specifics. Behind that announcement was a single man, an inmate named Taquan Brown. Brown was serving a 25-year sentence for voluntary manslaughter. He told investigators that, sometime after Brittanee's disappearance, he went to a McClellanville stash house to deliver money to a local dealer named Sean Taylor. Brown said he saw a young white girl inside being sexually assaulted by a group of men, including Taylor's teenage son, Timothy Deshawn Taylor. He claimed the girl tried to run. One of the men pistol-whipped her and dragged her back inside. Brown said he then heard 2 gunshots. He saw a body wrapped in a rug, carried out to the truck. According to him, her body was later dumped in one of the alligator-infested pits of the area. If true, it was beyond horrifying. The idea that Brittanee had been held, abused, then executed and fed to alligators captured public imagination immediately. The FBI considered the account credible enough to announce, on record, that Brittanee had likely been murdered, and to frame the McClellanville stash house as the key to the case. But there were problems. Search teams combed the alleged stash house and the surrounding swamps. They found no trace of Brittanee, no forensic evidence, no body, nothing. Brown's story shifted over time. In a 2019 TV interview from prison, he said he'd actually seen Brittanee multiple times after her disappearance, including weeks later at his cousin's property in another town, and claimed to have witnessed her being shot with a shotgun in the woods. The timeline stretched. Details changed. Other supposed witnesses he named couldn't be found, or were dead. Still, the damage was done. A whole new cast of villains had been introduced to the public story. The Taylors. Timothy Deshawn Taylor was 16 in 2009 when Brittanee disappeared. Years later, he got into trouble as the getaway driver in an armed robbery of a McDonald's. He was sentenced in a state court and, after cooperating with police, given probation as a youthful offender, while his co-defendants received much harsher sentences. To federal prosecutors, that lighter sentence looked like an opportunity. In 2016, shortly after Brown's stash house story became public, the federal government charged Timothy again, this time in federal court, for the same 2011 robbery. They explicitly cited his suspected involvement in Brittanee's disappearance as a reason they were pursuing the case. They offered him a deal. If he gave substantial, truthful assistance about crimes he knew about, including Brittanee's case, the most severe charge would be dropped. If he lied, or they believed he was lying, he could face 10 to 20 years. As part of that process, in June 2017, the FBI put Timothy on a polygraph. They asked if he knew who was involved in Brittanee's disappearance, or if he'd ever seen her. He said no. The examiner deemed his responses deceptive. Timothy grew angry and eventually refused to continue. Publicly, Timothy and his family insist he had nothing to do with Brittanee. His mother, Joan, said he'd been in school in McClellanville the day Brittanee went missing. Myrtle Beach wasn't someplace he'd be going at 16. By the time of the federal case, she said, he was caring for his sick grandmother at night. Activists called the federal case a witch hunt, arguing Timothy was being squeezed for information he simply didn't have. For 6 years, Timothy and his mother say they lived in fear, receiving death threats, insults, and harassment, constantly watching their backs as the media treated him as Brittanee's likely killer. In the end, the federal robbery case ended in 2019 with a sentence of time served, 319 days, matching his state disposition. Timothy walked free on the robbery, but carried the stain of being publicly linked to Brittanee's alleged murder. In 2024, he sued the FBI, accusing agents of abusing their power and pushing false narratives that caused irreversible emotional strain. We now know that the stash house story was just that, a story, and the man at the center of it, Timothy Taylor, had nothing to do with Brittanee's fate. But in 2016, 2017, and 2018, it was everywhere. That's important, because while investigators were chasing a phantom gang in an alligator pit, the real answer was already in their files. They'd had his name since 2012. They'd even searched his motel room. Raymond Moody. While attention swung toward McClellanville, another man's file had been gathering dust. Raymond Moody was, on paper, exactly the kind of person who should have been investigated aggressively from the beginning. In 1983, in California, he had been convicted of kidnapping and sexually assaulting a 9-year-old girl. Court records and later sentencing documents in South Carolina described a pattern of stalking, abducting, and raping multiple young victims over a 2-year period. He was given a 40-year sentence, but served only half before being released. After his release, he moved back home to Georgetown, South Carolina, roughly 10 miles from where Brittanee's phone would last ping in 2009. At the time of Brittanee's disappearance, Moody was living in a motel in Georgetown County. On April 26th, the same day searchers in Myrtle Beach were first looking for her, a traffic cop in Surfside Beach pulled Moody over. The officer noticed his face was covered in scratches. A former romantic partner later told investigators that, around the time Brittanee vanished, Moody's shaved head and face had what she described as claw marks all over them. His girlfriend, Angel Vouse, told investigators in 2011 that he was abusive and had disturbing fantasies about abducting girls. She said she'd once watched him tear down one of Brittanee's missing posters at a McDonald's because he was, quote, tired of looking at it every day. She told them she believed it if they said he was responsible for any disappearance in the area. She was terrified of him. In August 2011, investigators searched the Georgetown motel room where Moody had been staying around the time Brittanee vanished, but more than 2 years had passed. They found no physical evidence linking him to the crime. In February 2012, authorities publicly named him as a person of interest in Brittanee's disappearance. Then, as tips faded and the Stash House narrative grew, his name slips out of headlines. He was still there, though, living quietly, driving the same roads, passing again and again the swampy stretch where Brittanee's phone had last cried out to a cell tower. The question is, how did investigators finally come back to him? By the late 2010s, the investigation had stalled, but the technology had not. Around 2019, a new FBI team took a fresh look. They started where many cold case breakthroughs now begin, with data. They reanalyzed Brittanee's cell phone location information, tower pings from that April night. With improved tools, they were able to reconstruct not just where her phone had been, but how it was moving. They noticed something crucial. At one point, the phone's movement changed from a slow, walking pace to about 55 miles per hour. Suddenly, it wasn't a teenage girl walking down Ocean Boulevard anymore. It was a passenger in a car. The team then went to the area of the last walking speed ping and pulled every bit of surveillance footage they could find from nearby roads. They looked for vehicles passing through at the right time. Caleb Messer, an FBI intelligence analyst, later said that eventually there was one vehicle that stood out, a 1998 Ford Explorer. They ran the plate. It came back to a woman named Angel Vouse, Raymond Moody's longtime girlfriend. This was the moment when the case quietly pivoted away from stash houses and alligator pits and back toward a man who had been in their files for a decade. But they still needed more. Investigators dug deeper into Angel. They discovered a police recording in which she was heard telling a friend that she was responsible for Brittanee Drexel's death. That was enough to get her into an interview room. Angel told them she'd been drinking the night of that conversation. She said a friend kept asking about Moody, and she just wanted to take the attention off him, so she claimed responsibility. She admitted that statement wasn't true, but she did admit to something else. She said she had been in the car with Moody when they picked Brittanee up on the Myrtle Beach Strip. She said they drove her to a remote boat landing south of Georgetown, and that when she left Brittanee there with Moody, the girl was still alive. When she came back, Brittanee was gone. Moody told her a friend had picked the girl up. Angel told investigators she still had the phone she'd used at the time of Brittanee's disappearance and offered to locate it. Then she left and never followed through. So the FBI got a search warrant for that phone. When they went to execute it, they found themselves face to face with Raymond Moody. One investigator later recalled handing Moody a copy of the warrant and watching him realize what it meant. They were closing in, and they were willing to go after whoever we had to get justice for Brittanee. On May 4th, 2022, almost exactly 13 years after Brittanee vanished, Raymond Moody was arrested in Georgetown County, not yet for murder, but on an obstruction of justice charge tied to the Drexel investigation. The date of the alleged obstruction? April 25th, 2009, the night she disappeared. They had him in custody. They had his girlfriend tying him to the car. They had the phone data. They had the Explorer. What they needed now was the truth and a body. Soon after Moody's arrest, his lawyer reached out to the local prosecutor, Solicitor Jimmy Richardson, and asked for a meeting. In that meeting, and in subsequent interviews with investigators, Raymond Moody finally spoke. He admitted that on the night of April 25th, 2009, he and Angel were driving around Myrtle Beach in that Ford Explorer. In one later account, he used a chilling phrase: "We were hunting, driving the strip, looking for a girl." They saw Brittanee walking alone. In some versions of the story, Angel posed as a friendly tourist, offering Brittanee a ride to her hotel or to smoke marijuana. In others, Moody said he simply offered her some weed and told her to hop in. Either way, he claimed she got into the car willingly. From there, accounts of the exact sequence vary slightly, but the core is consistent. They drove her south, well beyond the hotels and party lights, toward a remote campsite or boat landing near the Santee River in Georgetown County, where Moody had set up a tent. At some point, Angel left, supposedly to take something to her son or care for a family member, leaving Moody alone with Brittanee at the campsite. Moody told investigators that he believed he could convince Brittanee to have consensual sex. When she refused, he raped her. Fearing she would report him and send him back to prison, as a convicted sex offender he knew what that would mean, he decided to kill her. He strangled her to death. In some versions, he described using a yellow nylon rope and later stabbing her body with an ice pick, details prosecutors have acknowledged but treated with skepticism. At first, he hid her body in bushes near the campsite. Later, he returned, moved her to a wooded area off Old Town Avenue near Pickerel Road, and buried her about 4 feet deep. He disposed of her clothes and purse in a donation bin, destroyed her identification, and threw her phone into the water. During his confession, he insisted Angel had not been present when he killed Brittanee. Phone records did show a period that night where Moody and Angel were not together. For the Drexel family, 13 years of nightmare did not end with that confession, but it did, finally, give them a way to bring her home. Moody agreed to lead investigators to the burial site. Between May 11th and 15th, 2022, FBI teams excavated a small, gated private drive off Old Town Avenue near Pickerel Road in Georgetown County. They first found a single human bone. Over the next days, they uncovered more remains. Dental records and DNA confirmed they were Brittanee Drexel's. On May 16, 2022, Georgetown County Sheriff Carter Weaver stood before cameras and announced what Brittanee's family already knew in their hearts. Their daughter was not missing anymore. She was dead, and they finally knew who was responsible. The arrest warrant alleged that on or about the night of April 25th, Moody forcibly confined Brittanee, committed sexual battery, and then killed her by manual strangulation. Because 13 years had passed, the coroner later said the official cause of death was undetermined. There was simply too little soft tissue left to say with absolute certainty. But prosecutors were clear. In their view, she was raped and manually strangled. The who, where, and how of the case were finally answered. The one question that might never be is why. On October 19, 2022, Raymond Moody appeared in a South Carolina courtroom and pled guilty to kidnapping, criminal sexual conduct, and murder in the first degree. Prosecutors laid out his crimes and his history. A sexual predator who had already spent 2 decades behind bars for harming children, released halfway through his original sentence, only to, quote, return to his wicked ways, as Don Drexel would later put it. In his statement to the court, Moody said, "I served 20 years, and I thought it was enough, but it wasn't. I was a monster then, and I was a monster when I took Brittanee Drexel's life. I don't have the words to express how horrible I feel. I'm very sorry." The apology rang hollow. Dawn addressed him directly. She spoke about years of torment, the sleepless nights, the endless searches, the not knowing. She said she now wears some of her daughter's ashes around her neck. She told the court that the criminal justice system had failed Brittanee the day it released Moody early from his California sentence, and she didn't stop there. She also spoke about Timothy Taylor and his family, about the way Moody's crimes had allowed a completely different family to become collateral damage in the hunt for answers. She called out the harm done when law enforcement and the media seize on speculation without solid evidence. At the end of the hearing, the judge sentenced Raymond Moody to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 2 consecutive 30-year terms. According to the South Carolina Department of Corrections, he will never walk free again. But the story doesn't end there. For a time, prosecutors did not charge Moody's girlfriend, Angel Vouse, with any crime related to Brittanee's murder. She had cooperated in 2022, wearing a wire, providing statements, and helping them secure the confession. They believed she was not present at the killing itself. Over time, as they reviewed her statements, a darker picture emerged. Angel had helped lure Brittanee into the vehicle. She'd driven while Moody restrained the terrified teenager. She'd taken Brittanee's phone, the only device that might have brought rescue, away from her, and she had lied repeatedly to investigators about the extent of her involvement. In March 2024, federal prosecutors charged Angel with 3 counts of making false statements to the FBI during their investigation into Brittanee's disappearance and death. She initially signed an agreement to tell the truth in exchange for consideration. She even briefly agreed to a plea deal for a shorter sentence, then backed out and said she wanted to go to trial. Eventually, in September 2024, she pled guilty to all 3 counts. On February 13, 2025, a federal judge in Charleston sentenced her to 18 years in prison, followed by supervised release. There is no parole in the federal system. The judge called her a, quote, key participant who facilitated the kidnapping of a child. In court, Don Drexel delivered a victim impact statement, telling Angel, "You messed with the wrong mom. A mother who will never stop in the fight to get justice for Brittanee. You are the angel of death." Angel, tearful, told the court, "I'm not a monster or a horrible person. I'm simply a person who became a victim early in life. My past is full of mistakes. I'm sorry for not speaking up sooner." The judge and the sentence made clear that whatever her past, those mistakes had contributed to a teenager's death. In January 2023, Dawn filed a civil wrongful death lawsuit against Raymond Moody, seeking damages for the loss of her daughter and for the emotional distress caused by 13 years of uncertainty. In February 2025, a South Carolina jury heard that case. Moody took the stand again and expressed regret. "I'm at a loss for words. I just have so much regret. I've realized it doesn't even matter how sincere I am about how I feel about the things I've done. It's just not enough." The jury agreed it wasn't enough. They unanimously ruled in favor of Brittanee's estate and awarded $200 million in actual damages and $500 million in punitive damages, a total of $700 million. They found that Moody had intentionally inflicted emotional distress on Dawn through his crime and years of silence. Moody will never be able to pay that amount. But the figure itself is symbolic, a public, legal statement of the magnitude of the harm he caused. Dawn also filed a separate civil suit against the Bar Harbor resort where Brittanee was staying when she disappeared. That case is proceeding separately. In one sense, the Brittanee Drexel case is exactly what it appears to be. A teenage girl sneaks away for spring break, crosses paths with a predator, and is murdered within hours. There is no trafficking ring, no gang stash house, no alligator pit. It is almost brutally simple. But in another sense, this case is about much more than a single crime. It's about the danger of speculation, about the power and the limits of informants, and about the quiet persistence of evidence, even when we don't want to listen to it. For years, the loudest stories about Brittanee's fate were the most sensational ones. A girl held captive for days, passed around by a crew of drug dealers, shot for sport, and fed to alligators. They were repeated in court filings, in news articles, and even in some true crime programs that treated them as fact. Meanwhile, her phone data, cold, unemotional, uninterested in drama, was telling a different story. It showed a sudden jump from walking speed to highway speed, suggesting a car. It showed that car passing south, not to McClellanville, but toward Georgetown County, near where a known sex offender lived. It showed the phone going dark near the Santee River, not near an alligator pit outside a stash house. When investigators finally went back to the data with fresh eyes and better tools, it led them to a specific vehicle, a specific driver, and a specific patch of woods where a body had lay for 13 years. In the words of one prosecutor, after 13 years, you take what he says, corroborate what you can, and his confession, plus the evidence, was enough. They didn't have to believe everything Raymond Moody said about that night. They just had to line up the parts that matched the phone, the surveillance footage, the scratches on his face, and the bones in the ground. There's one more thread running through this story. A mother's refusal to let it go. Dawn Drexel moved states. She searched swamps. She hounded investigators, wrote letters to the media, started a foundation called Brittanee's Little Angels to support families of missing and trafficked loved ones. She held vigils in South Carolina and New York every year her daughter was gone. When the FBI finally cracked the case, she honored them with pendants bearing Brittanee's face on one side and the words, "Thank you for finding me," on the other. Agents have said there is nobody more singularly responsible for the resolution of this case than Dawn Drexel. She didn't solve it alone, but she never let anyone forget that it needed solving. So what do we do with a case like this, on a show like this, in an era where true crime is both entertainment and, sometimes, a public square for amateur detectives? Maybe we start with a simple commitment. To remember that behind every blurry CCTV clip and every cell tower ping is a real person with a family listening. To be careful with theories that feel too satisfying. To question stories that rely on jailhouse confessions and faceless villains more than on hard evidence. To keep in mind the words of an attorney quoted in another context. You can promise yourself you will never kill someone, but you can't promise that someone will never say you did. For 13 years, Brittanee Drexel's story was told by people who didn't know what happened to her. Now, at least we know this much.